It's very commonly said that the root of most human unhappiness is the sense that one's life has no meaning. And I think it's very fascinating to think out what this idea itself means, or what it is intended when it's said that life has to have a purpose.
A few years back, I was taking a class titled Survey of Ancient and Contemporary Philosophy, where the major project for the semester was to define a personal philosophy. For me, this project was pretty daunting. I wasn't particularly interested in philosophy at the time, but my lack of interest in this assignment came to an end when the class discussions switched to the topic of existentialism. This branch of philosophy gripped me, and at times it felt like my professor was speaking directly to me. The chapter on existentialism revolved around an answer to a pretty intense question: does life have a purpose? And this was riveting to me because at the time, as well as before and after this class, I was plagued with panic attacks revolving around this exact question. About 3 or 4 times a month, I would fall into thought spirals that started with the concept of my own mortality and were accelerated by the idea that I would live a directionless life with no guidance, goal, or purpose. Then, I would die, and very shortly after that, an uncaring universe would forget me. My thoughts would twist tightly around themselves, suffocating my mind, stealing my breath, and gripping my chest. These thought spirals were sometimes manageable, other times the only escape was exhaustion. Knowing what I know now, I can see that these panic attacks were absurd. Not that I was being silly or ridiculous, but I mean absurd in the philosophical sense. This is a term that philosophers use to mean searching for answers in an answerless world. So, what's one to do? You can scream into the void all you want, but it's never going to scream back. Some people turn to God in search of purpose, but this isn't exactly the answer. While atheism and existentialism are not the same things, existentialism rejects the concept of teleology, or the idea that existence and its purpose are ordained by a divine being. In other words, God may have created you, the world, and the cosmos, but he didn't actually set a purpose for any of it. So, what's the purpose for life? Well, this is kind of where the conversation ends. Existentialists would say that there's not an answer to that question. There is no uppercase P purpose to capital L life. Instead, each human is free to decide. Unfortunately, this freedom may feel more like shackles. As Jean-Paul Sartre says, man is condemned to be free. Okay, let me rewind quite a bit of time. Back somewhere before 300 BC, a new way of thinking came about called Essentialism. And this was the belief that everything had essential properties that make that thing what it is. For example, a knife can still be a knife with a different handle, but it's not a knife if it doesn't have the blade. The blade is the essence of the knife. Small sidebar here, the conversation of whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich is actually essentialist philosophy and is a much deeper conversation about the way humans experience the world than we realize, and I think that's pretty cool. Now, since its inception, essentialism has been a hotly debated topic. That was until the postmodernists got all ho-hum about the Greeks and rejected the concept, delivering the final nail into the essentialist coffin. Another quick small sidebar here, this doesn't actually apply to Western theologists who often embrace teleology and essentialism in a religious context, but we really don't have enough time to discuss theological philosophy right now, so we're just going to say that essentialism died with the rise of postmodernism. It's close enough. Anyways, as a response, existentialism was created. It was the concept that we don't enter the world with purpose, but rather that purpose is created as we live. In the 1940s, Jean-Paul Sartre said, "Man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards." He would later boil this down in the 1950s by saying, quote, "Existence precedes essence." So, existentialism is born, and now people are getting down with the idea that humans can define their own purpose, and it will be different for everybody. In a sense, you're free. I love the way Albert Camus puts it. He says, the literal meaning of life is whatever you're doing that prevents you from killing yourself. But what is preventing me from killing myself? I mean, to be completely honest, the whole human experiment isn't actually going that great. The climate is dying, expectations from others are crushing, and I'm gonna go anyways, so why not go now? Well, the philosopher known as my roommate would say, yeah man, it'd be like that sometimes, but it's still vibes. And I guess he's kind of right, being alive is a vibe. So, what's gonna be my purpose? Well, this is where hedonism comes into play. Hedonism is a very old school of thought that has come a long way in the last 2,400 years, but it starts with this guy named Aristippus of Cyrene. Aristippus believed that humans live their life in a way that drove them towards pleasure and away from pain, as those are the only two true intrinsic values in life. He was against the concept of delayed gratification. If he were alive today, Aristippus would scoff at the concept that I'm going to college now to get a job that I will enjoy in the future. He would laugh at the concept of having a savings account for rainy days, and he would be a massive advocate for drug use. The concept of early hedonism is quite controversial. I mean, living your life in this way is reckless, selfish, and it's vain. These critiques of hedonism meant that early hedonism died with Aristippus. But 100 years later, Epicurus created modern hedonism, and he started by redefining the word pleasure. Epicurus viewed pleasure not as ecstasy, but rather tranquility. One place that Epicurus and Aristippus agreed was the concept that humans were naturally drawn towards pleasure and away from pain. Epicurus separated pleasure into two categories, kinetic and katasomatic. Kinetic pleasure is described as being more physical, such as scratching an itch, drinking, having sex. On the other hand, katasomatic pleasure is the emotional side of pleasure. David Wolfsdorf puts it in his book Pleasure in Ancient Greek Philosophy as the freedom from psychological disturbances. As much fun as kinetic pleasures can be, chasing these pleasures can leave one feeling anxious, and even when they're experienced, they will always fade away in time. For this reason, katasomatic pleasures is the pleasures a person must focus on to lead a fulfilling life, and for that reason, it was the pleasure that Epicurus prioritized. While the philosophical concept of hedonism waned in popularity over the next 2,000 years, one interesting thing is that the concept of long-lasting tranquil pleasures being prioritized over short-term ecstatic pleasures has held strong and is even a present theme in almost every religion practiced to this day. Now, moving forward in time, in the 1800s, almost 2 millennia late to the conversation, Thomas Carlyle wrote that this was swine philosophy, arguing that if pleasure and pain were the only two intrinsic values in life, people would prefer to be a well-kept pig, as that life would be good, if not better, than the average humans. But obviously we don't prefer that, we prefer to be humans. John Stuart Mills later wrote his book Utilitarianism, and in that was an attempt to debunk the swine philosophy. Mills wrote about higher and lower pleasures, saying that pleasures involved in being a human are higher than the pleasures involved in being a pig. This should remind you of Epicurus because a pig can experience kinetic pleasures in the same way that humans can. They can eat until they're full, they can have sex, and they've even been seen to eat fermented fruit and get drunk. But humans are unique in their ability to experience katasomatic pleasures that pigs are incapable of. Humans can climb mountains, build reputations, and help others like no other animal can. Katasomatic pleasures are uniquely human. So, here I am, standing at the crossroads of existentialism and hedonism. Existentialism tells me that I'm free to decide what my meaning of life will be, how I will pursue that meaning, and what the end result will be. But I'm nonetheless flawed, and that freedom is somewhat overwhelming. For a long time, I dove deep into the absurd, fighting against the concept that there is no one answer to the question of purpose. I fought against the truth for so long that by the time I realized that I was wrong, I was deep in the void of freedom. This freedom scared me, and some nights made it difficult to sleep. Luckily, there's a light illuminating this void, and that light is hedonism, and it's here to guide the way. That being said, it's easy to get lost in this light and frantically chase kinetic pleasures, but that only leads to opulence, greed, and despair. If one is to truly follow hedonism, examine pleasures, and pursue the ones that are katasomatic, you can find yourself in a more true state of pleasure, free from psychological disturbances. This pursuit will lead you to friends, family, relationships, and the occasional kinetic pleasure. And that is really why we're here. Life is short. Try to enjoy the ride.